Do your mixes sound like this? And you want them to sound like this? Then you've come to the right place. My name's Reese, and today we're going to be mixing down Telpha's track Reason, forthcoming on his album Back Home, due to be released on the 16th of the 12th, 2022. Slight disclaimer, this is more of a walkthrough than a tutorial, so it is best if you have some prior knowledge of mixing down tracks. So before we start the process, I'd just like to make a few quick notes. First off, a high-end recording studio is not entirely necessary for mixing down to a competitive standard. However, you should have quite a large amount of hours listening and analysing tracks on the equipment you own. It's also important to understand the frequency response of your equipment and how this can affect the sound of your mixes on other sound systems. For example, a popular choice is KRK Rockets, and they tend to have a boost in the low end, and this can lead to you turning down the bass more than you should. There are some VSTs such as Morphit, which inverts the frequency response of your equipment, and this gives you a much flatter response. It's also important to understand how sound is perceived to the human ear. Higher frequencies are perceived louder, so for the overall frequency response of the track, we should be looking to achieve a constant downward slope. And finally, consider your sound design and sample selection during the producing process. Sample selection and creating sounds with a purpose is so important, as it eliminates 90% of the problems when it comes down to mixing down the track. One pack that I particularly like to use for drums is Loud Fog Drums. It has a very high-end samples that do not require too much tweaking. So I like to start my mixdowns with the kick. So as with all my layers, I will add an EQ, and this is to eliminate any unwanted frequencies and also give space to other elements within the track. For this kick, I removed everything below around 60Hz to allow space for the sub, and then I added a high shelf to take away the top end for allow the hi-hats and perks to breathe. Sometimes I'll use the high cut, but it all depends on the track. No two tracks will be mixed down the same, so it's important to use your ears and to use references wherever possible to get the best results. I then added a transient shaper and I increased the attack, lowered the pump and lowered the sustain. This gives the drums very snappy characteristics and really allows them to break through the mix. When gain staging, I tried to keep the kick around -12 dB on the master channel. This is so that when it comes down to mixing down all the other elements, we'll be getting between -6 and -9 dB ready for the track to be sent for mastering. I used similar techniques on the snare with EQing and transient shaping, and I also added a saturator to bring out some of the harmonics to make the snare sound brighter after cutting away the top end. Remember, it's a lot easier to make a dual track sound bright than it is to bring back transients from a cluttered high end. The distortion and saturation of limiters and clippers will also bring out a lot of character during the mastering process, so try not to worry if you think your track isn't bright enough. I also added a slight amount of reverb just to help blend the snare in. I usually wouldn't add a reverb to the snare in a drum and bass track, but I felt it helped add to the huge Dancefloor style that it was produced in. The kick and snare were then sent to their own bus where a parallel compressor was added. Parallel compression is when you smash the original signal into a compressor so you're just left with the transients, and then that is blended back into the original sound. This can be done using a return bus, but I like to use iHeart New York as it can be done quickly and simply within a single VST. For the hi-hats, the low end was cut out to gain headroom and harsh frequencies were removed. Problematic frequencies to look for usually originate around the 3kHz and 5kHz areas. Soothe 2 is also a great plugin to tame harshness in the high end. The main hi-hat made use of a transient shaper, whereas the others were more used as frequency fillers. It is important to slightly pan your hats to give them space in the mix. You'd be very surprised as to how much clearer they will sound. You don't want to overdo it with a hard pan, but just slightly panning can produce great results. The hi-hats was then sent to their own bus where a multiband compressor was used to tame the high end and glue it all together. You don't want to push your high end too much as the transients will become lost in the mix. All the drums were then sent to a drum bus where a compressor was used to glue it all together. I usually try to hit around -3 dB on the meter and then use the makeup gain to get it back up to volume. If there is the option to clip the signal, I would also select that as well. After mixing the drums, I tend to go straight to the sub. I start off by removing the low end frequencies. Usually anything below 30Hz will do, as these frequencies are not audible to the human ear and most sound systems won't even be able to produce these frequencies. However, they can still be distorted and take up headroom, so it's best to just get rid of them. I then cut everything above 100Hz to allow space for the other elements of the track. Cutting above this frequency will also beef up the sound of these sub, making it sound much thicker. I then add a sidechain compressor which is linked to the kick. What this will do is duck the signal every time the kick is played. This is to remove unwanted distortion, muddiness, and also to gain more headroom. Sidechaining doesn't have to be done with a compressor, it can be done with LFO tools, dynamic EQs, gates, and even by simply drawing in the volume automation yourself. I'd highly recommend experimenting with all of them, especially if you're struggling to get your kick to sit correctly in the mix. A standard compressor was then added to keep the sub at a consistent volume throughout the track. The bass was done in a gritty Reese style, however the client made it clear that this layer was not the focal point of the track and was there just to fill out the low mids. I started by cutting out the low end below 100Hz to make room for the kick and the sub, and then removed muddy frequencies around the 200 and 300Hz range. The rest of the EQ was then tailored to make space for the vocals, mid-synths and top-end drums. A mid-side EQ was then added to get rid of the frequencies below 400Hz from the stereo signal. This is to remove muddiness and increase headroom. The bass was then saturated to introduce harmonics that were dulled from the EQ processing. A dynamic EQ was then added that was sidechained to the snare. However, only the fundamental frequencies of the snare were used. This was to increase prominence of the snare while also keeping the bass consistent and less bouncy. Compression was then used to further consistency within the mix. The sub and bass were then sent to their own bus where a glue compressor was added. This is to make the two layers feel as if they are one. Between -3 and -4 dB I found work best in this situation. For the synths, I started by EQing out the low end, again around 100Hz, and high shelved at around 7K to make room for the top end drums. Around 300Hz was notched out to remove the muddiness. Depending on the dynamics of the track and the request of the customer, you may want to add some slight compression to the individual layers. However, Telpha requested that the track remain dynamic, so I chose not to do this in this instance. For effects such as white noise, I low cut between 300 and 500Hz, and also high shelved at around 7K. I also took out some of the mid-range to create space for other elements. White noise is there to fill out the frequency spectrum rather than to be used as an actual instrument. The synths were then sent to a bus where a dynamic EQ was used and that was sidechained to the vocals. This was so that clashing frequencies were eliminated and allowed both sets of instruments to be clearly audible. Slight glue compression was then used to just make all the synths function as one unit, however the amount of compression was less in comparison to the bass and sub bus, for example, to maintain the dynamics. Sidechain compression was then used to the kick and snare bus, however there was only about a 9 dB reduction. This was to blend the drums in with the synths rather than focus on one or the other. The vocals were EQ'd to remove the low frequencies. I'd recommend experimenting with removing between 150 and 300Hz. The muddiness in the mid-lows was then notched out, and then problematic frequencies were identified and removed. You can do this by creating a notch with a high Q, and then isolate the frequencies. If it hurts your ears, just take it away. Again, a high shelf was used to create space for the top end drums. A mid-side EQ was used to remove low end from the side image, but I also choose to increase the top end of the stereo field. A multi-band compressor was then added to tame the highs, and saturation was then used to reintroduce harmonics that were dulled from EQing. Slight compression was used to give a more consistent feel throughout the track, and I also used volume automation to fit the vocals into the mix better. Multi-band distortion was then added to beef out the vocals and give them more body in the low mid range, as I felt as if they began to feel a bit thin. And finally, Soothe 2 was added to tame the harshness. I would usually slightly sidechain the vocals to the kick and snare, however the client felt it made the track feel too bouncy, so this was removed. To make the vocals feel wider, a return bus was used which contained delay and verb processing, and that was then sidechained to the original dry signal. This was so the clarity of the vocals was not lost, and instead the effects were used to blend and create width. The mix bus was kept simple with a dynamic EQ and a multi-band compressor to control the mids and highs, as well as a glue compressor to simply blend all the elements together. Slight saturation was also used to bring out some of the harmonics, however I would not overdo this if you plan on sending the track out to be externally mastered, as the engineer will add saturation during their process. And that's about it, so thank you for watching. I hope you learned something new. If you have, please subscribe, and I'll be making a lot more tutorials.